Hello,
I've got a little itch.
this is Simon Brew, and that's Daniel Craig. Just bear with me a minute. I think he just wants me just to sort his itch out. Back in a sec. Did I get it? Where? Where then?
To the right.
Gotcha.
To the right.
All right, let's start the podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
In movies that had stories.
And the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover in this podcast, they're more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're movies I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. I just think it's really hard to make a film. I've got admiration and a half for the people who've managed it. And this podcast is a celebration of that. That's enough preamble, though. I kind of want to quickly get back down to business with the two films I'm going to talk about in this, the 197th episode of the podcast. I'm going to take you back to 2006. I'll play you a clip. We'll come to the story the other side of this.
I hope our little game isn't causing you to perspire.
It doesn't bother you killing those people.
Well, I wouldn't be very good at my job if it did.
How's our girl? Melted your cold heart yet?
James, get the girl out.
You're not going to let me in there. You've got your armor back on.
I have no armor left. You've stripped it from me. Whatever is left of me. Whatever I am. I'm yours.
The only question remains. Will you yield? In time?
That then was a clip from 2006's Casino Royale, and definitely not the 1967 version of Casino Royale. This one directed by Martin Campbell, screenplay credited to Neil Purvis, Robert Wade and Paul Haggis, based on the book Casino Royale by Ian Fleming, and with a cast led by Daniel Craig, Eva Green, Mads Mikkelsen, Jeffrey Wright and Judi Dench. And I mean, this is the film that rebooted Bond, that brought us to the start of an era of James Bond that's just coming to an end as this podcast is being recorded. But also it's a film that goes to the old adage, the film after tends to be a response to the film before. And so by most measures, 2002's James Bond movie, Die Another Day, was a big success. The box office was huge. The DVD sales were stellar. It was the fourth Pierce Brosnan headlined James Bond film. The films were getting more and more popular. The box office was going up each time. And the studio was happy. The money was rolling in. But there were problems, because at the heart of Die Another Day, whilst it would go on to make an awful lot of cash, there were two films in that movie. There's the first half of it gave an indication of where Bond could go. If you remember Die Another Day, the opening is really gritty, really down to earth, and quite a tonal shift from the films before. By the time you get to the end, you're in the land of invisible cars and weird chases across snow. Now, I quite enjoy the film. But conversely, over time, a bit of a backlash was emerging to Die Another Day. The film was being lampooned on panel shows, and the invisible car just became almost like a punchline to how daft all of these things had gone. Well, amongst the people who were very keenly listening to that were the producers and guardians of the Bond films, Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, who'd been steering the franchise since 1995's GoldenEye, which was when the late Albert R. Cubby Broccoli effectively handed it over to them. Now, I should state I'm drawing on an excellent book called Some Kind of Hero that I've talked about a few times on this podcast. I really do recommend digging that out, and it does go into the ins and outs of the Bond films in more detail than you're getting out of this podcast. But the point in 2002, after Die Another Day, it wasn't instantly a sure thing that they were going to head down the reboot path. In fact, if anything, they were looking at a spin-off, because off the back of the Jinx character in Die Another Day, played by Halle Berry, there was serious exploration of doing a James Bond spin-off movie based around that character. A script was written, a budget was worked up in the region of about $80-90 million. Stephen Frears at one stage was toying with directing the movie. It was quite close to coming together. And then MGM pulled the plug on it, much to the frustration of all those who'd been working on the film. Now, there was another thing that happened in 2002 that would also have a knock-on effect for the James Bond films, and that was the release of the first Jason Bourne movie, The Bourne Identity. And whilst The Bourne Identity was a hit in cinemas, it was a gigantic hit on DVD. It really found its audience, and stylistically, it felt a lot different from where James Bond had been going. So by the time it came to making the next James Bond film, I think Michael G. Wilson was fairly open about the fact that because of where they'd gone with Die Another Day, they were heading to a point where the next movie was basically going to be a sci-fi film. And Bond had, of course, entertained sci-fi with Moonraker, and let's just say that had not gone well. Although the villain in Moonraker, I still think, is quite exceptional. So what Broccoli and Wilson decided to do was to dig up the plan to go back to basics, although it wasn't really their plan, because this goes back to the way the rights to the Ian Fleming source novels were divvied up. That the original deal that was struck for the novels didn't have Casino Royale in it. That Casino Royale was the rights that were sold separately, and then the rest of the Bond books went in a different package. And so Albert R. Broccoli in his lifetime had always entertained wanting to make Casino Royale, but couldn't get the rights to do it. Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, well, they kind of floated it around for the Pierce Brosnan era at one point, but again, they didn't have the rights at that point to do it. And those rights, because of an earlier film, that the earlier comedy film dating all the way back to 1967, that's not great really, but those rights had now landed with Sony. And Sony at this stage had no involvement with the James Bond movies. I did hear a story that the Spider-Man rights were ultimately wrapped up in the exchange that happened. I can't say for certain that was the case. What I can say is that a deal was done between Eon Productions and MGM and Sony that ultimately, at the end of the 1990s, finally secured for Eon and the official James Bond line of films the film rights to the book Casino Royale. This then was the plan. A back to basics James Bond. The first time we see James Bond on the big screen without his 00 status. The idea of a younger Bond, a rawer Bond, an unvarnished loose cannon Bond, rather than the more assured agent that we've been used to seeing in the Pierce Brosnan era. Now, with the Jinx spin-off coming to an end, that project coming to an end, and Casino Royale now looking like it was taking centre stage, there was then the matter of Pierce Brosnan. Now, Pierce Brosnan was the incumbent 007 and had been a successful one. The problem here was he was out of contract, but there was the assumption that he would return to do a fifth James Bond movie. Pierce Brosnan wanted to do a fifth James Bond movie. Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson were less keen on doing so. Brosnan had problems with his era, across his era of Bond, that he did want things to get a little less fantastical. On Tomorrow Never Dies, he wanted it to get a bit more organised. I've covered that in a previous episode of the podcast. But he went off to shoot a film he was committed to for a director, Brett Ratner, who isn't directing films anymore for reasons you can easily read about online. And that film was After the Sunset. And so off he went to the Bahamas to shoot the film. And then he got a call from his agent that the news was being relayed to him that Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson had decided not to renew his contract. He was no longer going to be James Bond, and this came as something of a bolt from the blue. Now, he took a call a few days later from Broccoli and Wilson where they confirmed the news. They thanked him for all the work he'd done as Bond. But he's less happily admitted it, but he's admitted it in the past, that he found himself in shock. There were stories doing the rounds about his salary demands. Did he want $30 million? Did he want a cut of the box office gross? Brosnan's always vehemently pushed back against this. There's also the case that there wasn't a push from MGM, which was having financial issues at this point, for a change, because it had a successful formula here. It had a successful Bond. It certainly wasn't desperately looking to hit the reboot button. This was an Eon decision. There was no wriggling around that the production company behind Bond had decided to take a different path. Now, Brosnan didn't take this decision lying down. He would, once he'd wrapped up on After the Sunset, he would have another conversation with Broccoli and Wilson, but it became very clear that their mind was made up. It was time for a new 007, and in February 2004 came the official announcement from Brosnan that he was stepping down from the role of James Bond. The search was on for another 007. Now, against that backdrop, I briefly hinted there that MGM, the co-owners of the film franchise to Bond, wasn't having the best of times again. Now, the story of MGM throughout the 90s and 2000s is one of heavy financial problems. I've talked about it in the past on this podcast when discussing Skyfall, for instance, and the ramifications of MGM's cash shortages and what impact that had on the delay to Skyfall. Also, the Hobbit movies were heavily delayed because MGM couldn't get the financing together for them. And so by the time it came to Casino Royale, which was slightly earlier, before the even higher profile issues that the studio was having, a deal was inked with Sony Pictures. Now, Sony, ironically, which a few years before had sold the rights to Casino Royale to allow this project to go ahead, was now about to buy into the Bond franchise. By September 2004, a deal had been inked. Sony, then headed by Amy Pascal, was in place, and a meeting took place between the new studio backers and Eon, where the news was, as if they didn't know already, the news was confirmed to them that they were looking for a course correction of sorts with the Bond movies. They were looking to go gritty. They were looking to take this back to basics. And this was before the release of 2005's Batman Begins, which sometimes falsely is described as some kind of template for what Casino Royale was. But the truth is, the Casino Royale decisions were already in flow at this point. It just so happened that they were running alongside each other. Sony agreed with the new direction, and that was a bold gamble for the studio. This was not the safe choice, although the fact that the Bourne franchise was bubbling up and seen as such a rival, it almost found itself, Bond, in a similar position that it had in the 90s, where James Cameron's True Lies threatened to undercut what the Bond films were doing, and then a reboot happened with GoldenEye that put the Bond films, again, on a separate course. Here they were again just over a decade later. Also here again were writers Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, who'd been involved in that Jinx spin-off. They've been writing the Bond movies now, right the way through the Brosnan era, and they were the returning writers charged with penning the effective reboot, a day one James Bond. Even while the search was going on in the background for who would be 007, the pair were charged with, well, how do we do this? And they went through an assortment of variations on what Casino Royale could be and on bringing the character back to basics. They wrestled with the original ending of the book, which ultimately would change for the film. They also went to and fro with the text and tried to be as faithful, certainly, to the character as they could from that. They took out his Bond's heavy smoking, but they really wanted to capture what Fleming had in what was described in the end by Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson as the template for the character. It was Wade and Purvis who came up with the idea of go for the starker opening that we get in the film, make it black and white, have it an absolute statement of intent that this is, from the off, a stylistically very different Bond movie. And it was a relatively faithful adaptation that they put down on paper, although the script was some way yet from being complete. Now, meanwhile, with Sony's bank balance now securing the film, Eon was in a position to A, know that it was happening, and B, could go off looking for a new director. Now, the director of the previous movie, Lee Tamahori, he wasn't going to return. He had flirted with the idea of doing the Jinx film, but the idea was they were going to do something different. So Matthew Vaughn, I mean, I've talked to Matthew Vaughn a couple of times, and he's open about the fact that he had, in his mind, the James Bond film for the James Bond directing job for a matter of minutes, really. That his 2004 movie Layer Cake, after a successful producing career, I mean, he produced Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels and then moved into directing. Well, Layer Cake had proven a success and had really put him on the map, and it certainly put him on the map for the Casino Royale job. However, it wasn't long before Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson thought, we don't actually want Matthew Vaughn, and while there were conversations, it wasn't to be. Now, Roger Michell, who'd directed another Layer Cake had Daniel Craig in it, as did Roger Michel's Enduring Love. He was sounded out as well. I mean, his biggest film is Notting Hill. I've covered him before on the podcast for the movie Morning Glory. I mean, do take out, is it Changing Lanes, the film he did with Ben Affleck and Samuel L. Jackson? So, I mean, he's got a real backlog of work that's worth checking out. He was sent the project and sounded out about directing it, but he turned it down as well. Now, Eon then decided to go back to Martin Campbell. Martin Campbell had been the director who rebooted Bond with 1995's GoldenEye, and he'd been asked to return since then, but had declined the opportunity to do so. Instead, he went off and pursued The Mask of Zorro, and at this point, he was working on The Legend of Zorro, a belated sequel to that movie. It didn't quite work out as well as The Mask of Zorro did, but he was now sounded out, would he be interested in coming back to Bond? Also in the mix was Quentin Tarantino. The idea of doing Casino Royale, that appealed to Tarantino, although he would have wanted to do it, as reports go, with Pierce Brosnan as Bond, and he would have wanted to take it out of the continuity of the Bond franchise as it stood and kind of add his own stylistic choices to it. Now, the way that Broccoli and Wilson work is they ultimately are the guardians of the franchise, and to have a very maverick director come in and have their own way with it is never really likely to happen. Look at Danny Boyle dropping out of No Time to Die, for instance, when he wanted to go his own way with it. Look at Michael Caton-Jones. I did a long interview with him, and he talked about meeting with Broccoli and Wilson, but he's very sure in his own mind of what he wanted to do, and it didn't gel with what Broccoli and Wilson wanted. Tarantino really was ultimately going to be a non-starter for this one. But Martin Campbell was different, because after years of not being tempted to return to James Bond, what he was lured back with was the idea of, well, we could do this as a total reboot. And the idea of redefining 007 on the big screen, well, Campbell was once again back on board. He said yes, this worked for him, and he came on board and he got hold of the script that had been penned by Purvis and Wade, and he started to make, to put his fingerprints on it. An overhaul soon followed. Now, Paul Haggis at this point, he was interested in the Oscars for the Best Picture winner Crash, and he'd written the screenplay for the Best Picture winner $1 Million Baby. He was asked to come on board and do some rewrite work on the movie, which he duly did. One of the things that he's credited with is altering the ending to the one we got, although, as I understand it, Purvis and Wade came up with the, slight spoiler, idea of a building sinking towards the end of the film, which does diversify from the book slightly. But Haggis came in particularly working on the final act of the movie, and the whole story, as well, as Martin Campbell would explain, would be modernised, that whilst it would be faithful to the book. I mean, he gave an interview with IGN, I think it was, just the year before the film came out, saying they're going to stay faithful to the book, but obviously there are bits that have to be updated. I mean, the book is set in the Cold War. This would be set in a more modern era, and that would have ramifications to the villainous character of Le Chiffre and his motivations and just how he goes about his dastardly plans. But those were modernisations that still nonetheless kept the framework of the text. So, with Campbell on board, there was still the small matter of who's the new James Bond. So meetings had been underway and the casting was extensive, that you don't turn up, as you might expect, to do a single audition for a James Bond film and just get told whether you've got it or not, that the auditions and the testing took a lot longer than that. And I mean, there's always a great big long list of potential candidates for James Bond. Just ahead of recording this podcast, we're at a point where No Time to Die, Daniel Craig's fifth James Bond movie, is weeks away from release, and so it's widely also expected to be his last Bond movie. So I looked up the odds for who's likely to be the next Bond, and the list goes into dozens. So if you go down to the 500 to 1 odds, they're equal on Gerard Butler and Eamon Holmes. If you're not listening from the UK and you don't know who Eamon Holmes is, let's just say, just give me the money and don't put the bet on him being the new 007. Amongst the names who were in the mix this time then, I mean, Henry Cavill, he was of interest, but was deemed too young at that stage. Ewan McGregor, Julian McMahon from Nip Tuck, Carl Urban, Sam Worthington. I mean, Sam Worthington was in lots of movies at the time. Tests were being done with a whole series of actors. And one of those actors was a man called, wouldn't you know it, Daniel Craig. Now, Craig has been open about the fact that his first audition didn't go particularly well. He was in the midst of shooting what would become quite a troubled film, a remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers called The Invasion, which I think Nicole Kidman co-starred with him. And so he flew in from the set of that movie with his hair dyed blonde for the character in that film and did his test, and he didn't go particularly well, and then he had to fly straight back out again. But what Craig didn't know was that he had real advocates in that room, and in particular, Barbara Broccoli was driving for Daniel Craig to be cast as the new James Bond. She really saw something in him, and Michael G. Wilson was behind her with that choice. The pair of them thought that Craig had something. That said, this was, again, no overnight decision. I mean, Craig would go off while the speculation continued to build and while he would fend off questions about the role and make the movie Munich with Steven Spielberg while they were all making their mind up. But the other point was that Craig was a little bit reluctant because he'd watched the Bond films, he'd seen them get a bit silly, and did he really want to be James Bond in the midst of something so ostensibly quite daft, really? And the truth was, he didn't. If he was doing Bond, it would have to be different. And as much that was the version of 007 that was pitched, he still waited to read the script. And so by the autumn of 2005, Paul Haggis had got his version of the script to a point that Martin Campbell was happy with, that Purvis and Wade had done their bits separately. So I think there's a little bit of just a divide there. But nonetheless, here was a screenplay that could be sent to Daniel Craig with an offer to play James Bond, and his reservations about it were over once he read the script. And as he described, he got offered the role while he was out shopping. And so he decided to stop shopping and to go off and celebrate. Daniel Craig was the new James Bond. Now, the press conference was then called, and this would turn out to be quite an infamous one, for October the 14th, 2005. And this was going to announce a fair few things, really. It was announcing the name of the film, pretty well known at this point, the release date of the film, when it was shooting, and it was introducing, pretending there was a veil of mystery to this, the new Bond. And thus, Daniel Craig was put on the back of a speedboat, shot along the Thames, looking cold and uncomfortable, dishevelled and not very 007-like, to be introduced to the world's press. Here he was. The new James Bond has been cast. And the world's press, whilst it covered the story, it was not massively impressed. In fact, I mean, the tabloid headline the following day, I remember it, was James Bland, that one of the tabloids went wide with. And then, of course, there was the infamous fan protest, and one or two of these websites remain up to this day about Daniel Craig is not James Bond. There was a vehement minority. Who knew that the internet could react to a piece of casting in a negative way? And in the mid-2000s, that was harder to do than it is now. You couldn't just go on social media and have a moan about it. People built websites to protest against the posting, the casting of Daniel Craig. And you don't have to search far to find them. And a lot of those original articles and predictions about how disastrous the Craig era would be remain intact and online. I pass that on without comment. Also confirmed at this point, Martin Campbell was going to direct. Judi Dench was returning as well. Now, Craig went into training to bulk up for the part. That's worth noting at this point. And the other James Bonds around at the time came out and supported his casting. The other bits of the cast were coming together, but this would, going back to the idea that this would be a raw nascent Bond, really, lots of the trappings of the 007 franchise were removed. That there were going to be no gadgets in this one, so you're not going to need the character of Q for a start. The one who came back that in any continuity sense makes no sense whatsoever was Judi Dench in the role of M. She'd played this role across the 4 Pierce Brosnan films. Would she still be M? Really? If you actually sat and worked a timeline of all of this out? No. But, and I agree with this argument, she's Judi Dench. Who could at that point do that role better? And I think the interactions between Judi Dench and Daniel Craig across his run were really quite something. Mads Mikkelsen, he came to the attention of the casting team off the back of a series of Dutch films that he'd made, and he was cast relatively easily in the role of Le Chiffre, and he's again, he is just great in the movie. In fact, the casting throughout, I think, is uniformly really strong. One of the tricky roles was Vesper, the woman who James Bond falls in love with in this film, and a very different at that stage from the usual female lead in a Bond film, in that it's often played for sex appeal rather than fully fleshing out a character. I think I can say that there are instances of that, and that caused nerves with one or two of the people who were linked with the movie. Now, the choice ultimately apparently boiled down to Olivia Wilde or Eva Green. And Eva Green, for instance, was one of them who was just a little bit reticent. Did she want to just play the sexy Bond girl? Well, no, she read the script and realised there was a lot more of the character of Vesper than she was expecting. Nonetheless, what the previous 2 Bond films had done, in large part to appeal to an American audience, was bring in an American star as part of the ensemble. We had the casting of Denise Richards as Christmas Jones, for instance, in The World Is Not Enough. Halle Berry had been so popular in Die Another Day, she nearly got a spin-off film. And Angelina Jolie, in this case, was one of those mentioned for the role of Vesper, and she would confirm in an interview in 2010 that she turned the chance down to appear in Casino Royale because she was pregnant at the time. But there were other, Charlize Theron, I think her name was mentioned at this point. But it boiled down to a choice that was made and announced in February of 2006 that Eva Green would be taking on the role of Vesper. Audrey Tautou came close, but the fact that she was involved in the film The Da Vinci Code, which would come out the same year, really knocked her out of contention. Eva Green had landed the role. There was also Jeffrey Wright. He would come on board to play Felix. Giancarlo Giannini would be Mattis. Jesper Christiansen would be in to round out the ensemble as Mr. Y. And there was this new collection of faces, Judi Dench accepted, in front of the camera for James Bond. Now, behind the camera, what Martin Campbell did is he brought in quite a lot of his personnel who'd worked with him on GoldenEye. And people like Peter Lamont came back in to design the film as well. And so there was an assured collection of experience, certainly behind the camera, even as we had a whole bunch of people in front who'd not been in the franchise before. Now, Campbell was promoting The Legend of Zorro around this time as well, and he gave information about Casino Royale as he did so. And for instance, he confirmed to IGN, he just said it's pretty much the last 2/3 of the movie will be like the book, and just affirming that Cold War change was going to be one of the deviations from the text. And then it was all ready to go. The aforementioned black and white sequence was in. The removal of so much product placement had been ordered as well in an attempt to address some of the criticisms that had been aimed at Die Another Day. And at the end of January 2006, 10 months before release, Casino Royale started shooting. And I have no idea why the Bond franchise continually backs itself into this corner, but it seems to manage it particularly well in that these huge, really taxing productions rarely start shooting more than 10 months before their actual release date. It's just staggering to my untrained eyes, but clearly it works. Now, this would be a film primarily based at Barrandov Studios in Prague in the Czech Republic, that it was an era where the British tax relief support for filmmakers was still quite weak. There would be changes that would be brought in not long afterwards that would make it all a little bit easier and make the UK more attractive for filming. Nonetheless, unlike Licence to Kill, where the situation got so extreme that they didn't shoot any of it in the UK, there was still a Pinewood Studios base too for the movie, but most of this would be done on location and on their travels. That the film would go to Prague, it would go to Italy, it would go into Venice, of course, for the sequence at the end. Prague would be used to double for quite a lot of the locations and places within the film. There were moments such as, the climactic Venice sinking sequence that alone took 3 weeks of filming, and that was based at Pinewood, where they had to build a structure around the massive water tank at Pinewood to be able to physically produce that sequence, because one of the things Martin Campbell was driving for, was precious little visual effects in this. An awful lot of this is done physically, that they've been pushed back again against Die Another Day for just how digital some sequences had gone. They were looking to avoid that with this film. But also, unusually, and this was one of the things that Sony was up against when it was asked about pushing this particular film, the movie almost stops. I love this about Casino Royale, for a poker game in the middle. At a point where usually a film is just bashing around with big action, they stop and play cards, and a very, very tense card game as well. Now, in order to make that central poker game work dramatically, for a start, it took just a day of rehearsing just to sort out all the hands and the camera positions and different ways to potentially shoot this. And then to actually shoot the game, that was another 2 weeks in all to get it right. That they tried a couple of different approaches for filming it before settling on the one that they got. When they did go outdoors, there was a battle to keep the world's press at bay. Paparazzi were desperate to get a shot of the new James Bond at work. He was tabloid fodder now. The story was building. This new James Bond is going to be rubbish. Let's take some pictures to prove it so we can write more articles telling people how rubbish it's going to get. And so when he was shooting in, I think it was in the Bahamas, the infamous sequence where he steps out of the sea in the swimwear that he got from Primark, the world's press were, the camera lenses were in the background, that they were having to be kept at bay while the Bond film could carry on shooting. Craig, for one, would feel the battles of playing Bond. I think it was damage to his teeth on this one. No shortage of cuts and bruises as well, no matter the fact that he'd beefed up significantly to play the character. That said, on most of the Bond films, he sustained some kind of injury that led to a delay in filming, less so in this one. And so the movie was able to wrap up its physical production in July of 2006. There was some miniature work being done as it came back to Pinewood to finish off the shooting. And then it was into a very fast-paced post-production period on the film. Now, in line with the way that Bond films are made, this one's edited by Stuart Baird, who directed films like Executive Decision and Star Trek Nemesis. So I've talked about him a few times on the podcast. There was an editing team working round the clock whilst the shooting of this was going on. And the plan was get the movie ready for a very firmly marked, and it had been staked out a long way in advance, 14th of November 2006 premiere date, ahead of a wide cinema release on the 16th of November 2006. The post-production got underway at speed. David Arnold was brought in to score the film, and again, going back to some of the decisions they wanted to make about a reboot, he would hold back the infamous James Bond theme until the very, very end of the movie. Chris Cornell was confirmed as singing the title track, You Know My Name. That was in July of 2006. And then the world held its breath. What would this new James Bond be like? Would the tabloids be correct? Well, no, they wouldn't. The response to Casino Royale was pretty ecstatic, really, particularly because of what it had disposed of from the film before. But also there was a feeling that perhaps with the last 15 minutes aside, this was as good as James Bond had been for a long time. That Daniel Craig as James Bond, the whole loose blunt weapon, was as good as Bond had been for a long time. It felt like a huge course correction, and it felt like it threw down the gauntlet as well to the Bourne films too. And it wasn't just the critics who agreed with this. By the time the movie landed in cinemas, the audience was on side as well. I mean, it hadn't been a cheap film to make. It cost $150 million just to realise. And this was on 2006's money. And when it opened in the US, though, it didn't open at number one. It opened with a 40 million opening weekend. So Sony wouldn't have been too dispirited by that. Opened against Happy Feet, which stole its thunder, $41.5 million. They both knocked Borat off the top of the charts, but Casino Royale would hang around and hang around and hang around, and by the time its run was complete, it had done $616 million worth of business worldwide. Also, though, it had secured 9 BAFTA nominations, including a Best Actor nomination for Daniel Craig, and the level of the critical response to this really vindicated Eon's faith in Craig and in the idea of a reboot. It was so much so that Sony used this heavily to promote its then nascent Blu-ray format. It shifted a lot of Blu-rays at the point that the format was just springing to life. But also what it also meant was that they were really keen to get going on a second film, and to get going on a second film really, really quickly. Quantum of Solace would follow 2 years later, and for the first time would pick up directly from the ending of the Bond film before. That, though, is a story for another time. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and for putting up with me. Just a couple of little bits of business. My live show is on in Birmingham in the UK on the 29th of September 2021. You can find ticket details on my website, filmstories.co.uk. I'd love to see loads of you there if possible. That would be great. If you like this podcast as well, I am fully independent. I have no great big huge company. I have no company behind me. It's just me in the West Midlands. There are 3 ways you can support me, and I'd be grateful for any of them, really. All of them if you want, I don't mind. I'm on Patreon, patreon.com/Simon Brew. You get lots of stuff early on Patreon there, and little bits of news of what I'm up to. If you do like the podcast, please do subscribe. It makes such a huge difference to independent podcasts. Likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, I'd massively appreciate that too. I'm also working on the new issue of Film Stories magazine. I'll be telling you a lot more about that over at the website, store.filmstories.co.uk for that. It's up for pre-order now. But I'm already running over, so I want to quickly get to the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about. I'm going to move forward a few years to 2012. James Bond's going to crop up in this story again, but this is about an animated feature. Let me play you a clip. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
We go by many names and take many forms. We bring wonder and hope. We bring joy and dreams. We are the Sandman and the Tooth Fairy. We are the Easter Bunny and Santa. And our powers are greater than you ever imagined.
So what you got there was a snippet from the trailer from 2012's Rise of the Guardians, directed by Peter Ramsey, screenplay by David Lindsay-Abaire, based on The Guardians of Childhood by William Joyce, with a voice cast including Chris Pine, Alec Baldwin, Isla Fisher, Hugh Jackman and Jude Law. And the story of this one begins with William Joyce, that when his daughter was young, he used to tell us stories of the backstories and the side stories of characters we know, like the Easter Bunny, like Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy. Not outright fictional characters per se, because they're characters we all have some degree of knowledge of, well, most of us do, some degree of knowledge of, some degree of investment or at least a spin on. So he was taking stuff that was familiar and turning them into, some quite dark stories in some cases. Now, he then started developing this into an idea called the Guardians of Childhood series. And I mean, alongside this, Joyce was busy in the film industry as well. That I mean, no shortage of work within the film industry. He worked with Blue Sky Studios he'd been part of Pixar, working on things like Toy Story and A Bug's Life. And he was moving forward to wanting to direct his own movies. So he thought there was something in Guardians of Childhood, and he developed this idea, and he put together a short film off his own back, a proof of concept really, called Man in the Moon. And it was with the ideas of the stories that he designed for his daughter and this short film that he started entertaining movie offers for what all this could be. Now, Pixar, for instance, at one stage he was in conversations with about it, but Pixar just wanted the film, really. What skewed him more towards DreamWorks Animation, which at that point was going through a huge run of success, was a meeting with its boss at the animation side, Jeffrey Katzenberg, again, a name that comes up a lot across my podcast. And Katzenberg liked the idea of not just doing the film, but also the Guardians of Childhood series of books, and that unlocked it. Here was the opportunity to put across these stories in two different forms with a company the size of DreamWorks just backing it as well. Now, by this stage, Joyce he produced Robots. Do you remember that one? The Blue Sky one? I think Ewan McGregor was in the voice cast for that. Oh, another of his books have been picked up by Disney, Meet the Robinsons, a hugely underrated Disney movie. I think that one is. But this time, in the guise of what became Rise of the Guardians, he was going to direct as well. And so in November 2009 came the announcement. Playwright David Lindsay-Abaire was brought in to write the script with Joyce for the movie, but also that DreamWorks had hired a filmmaker by the name of Peter Ramsey, who was going to co-direct this movie with William Joyce. So Peter Ramsey, who I've had the joy of interviewing a few times, he had an initial background as a storyboard artist. He then also did second unit directing for John Singleton, films like Poetic Justice, but his storyboard and illustration work would cover films such as Bram Stoker's Dracula, Batman Forever. He worked on AI, he worked on Hulk, he worked with Roland Emmerich, and ultimately he landed off the back of a meeting someone he met while doing some second unit work on Rachel Talalay's Tank Girl movie in the mid-90s, and it led to a call to invite him into DreamWorks Animation. Why doesn't he come and have a look there? And so he found himself working on films like Shark Tale. He worked on Shrek the Third, and eventually got to a point where he directed a short film for DreamWorks Animation, the spin-off Monsters vs. Aliens: Mutant Pumpkins from Outer Space. He was then involved with developing the Shrek spin-off Puss in Boots, but the opportunity arose for Rise of the Guardians. That project had been bubbling at DreamWorks for a couple of years. It had a director's seat available for it. Ramsey was sounded out, and he jumped aboard. Now, there is a sad part to this story, that the idea was that Ramsey and Joyce would make this film together, but Joyce's daughter by this stage was seriously ill, and she would in fact, Mary Catherine Joyce, would pass away at the age of 18 from a brain tumour, and the film is beautifully dedicated to her, and fully understandably, William Joyce would step away from directing the movie, leaving Ramsey as the sole director, taking it forward to its ultimate release. And I mean, Ramsey told me once about finding the characters of this film and just the design and just trying to put it all together. And he just said, I started realising how much our perception of these characters, the likes of Santa and so forth, is shaped by the media. How much of that perception is unexamined. And when you scratch the surface just a little, you realise how archetypal most of them are. Santa Claus, like Zeus, Falstaff, big energy, generosity, wildness, the Easter Bunny, nature, even the Tooth Fairy with the idea that teeth hold the memory. And he said they all started seeming like Greek gods to me, and they started just subverting a little. Now, Guillermo del Toro was working with DreamWorks at this time as well, and he was pivotal really in helping to restructure the story. Now, Katzenberg, in one of the early meetings he'd had with William Joyce, had suggested the idea of base this first film, because the plan was lots of them, on introducing a new Guardian to the collection of characters. And so Del Toro took that and worked with them on bringing that all together. Also brought in fairly early was Roger Deakins, the Academy Award-winning cinematographer. The Team Deakins podcast is terrific if you ever get a chance. And he helped with the visual look and the lighting of the movie. But the project really had come together. And as much as animated movies don't have a strict here is a start of production, there was momentum behind this. DreamWorks was also at an ambitious point in that it was looking to up its production. Its films were regularly becoming big hits, and it was looking for franchises. And so on it went. I mean, there was some big names as well linked with the movie. That Leonardo DiCaprio at one point was set to be amongst the voice cast for the film before he ultimately dropped out. But nonetheless, DreamWorks animation films were traditionally cast with big movie names. That even if you go back to the hand-drawn movies, it was doing very early in its existence. It chased the big names. And so Katzenberg worked his contacts book here. He got in Jude Law, Isla Fisher, Hugh Jackman, Chris Pine, Alec Baldwin, as high a profile cast as you would expect from a DreamWorks production. Now, the characters themselves, well, they were challenging, and they took a lot of their cues, the versions that we see in the film, from the ideas that William Joyce had put together. So because Santa Claus is from the north, they decided to make him a bit Cossack, and they gave him tattoos, they gave him a Russian accent, and I mean, that would potentially cause some pushback down the line. The idea of the Easter Bunny being something more of a warrior was, that was one idea that was just bandied around. The whole idea really that all of these characters just had to be pushed a little bit out of their comfort zone, but also the risk involved in that was, would an audience take to such skewed versions of characters they tended to be quite affectionate for? You know, Santa Claus had been redefined by a Coca-Cola truck, really, and that's how most of us perceive the character. They were looking at doing something very, very different in a movie that was going to come out around Christmas and would, to an extent, be sold as a Christmas family feature. In fact, the film was originally set to be released on November the 2nd, 2012, but there was some jiggery-pokery going on at this point. They wanted to avoid going up against an animated movie, and I'll come to this shortly. The whole idea that animated movies at that point were not positioned against animated movies because they were the competition, and thus on the radar at that point was a Pixar sequel, Monsters University. So DreamWorks pushed its film back until later in that November, and ultimately, in the end, Pixar would delay Monsters University into the following year. Wreck-It Ralph would come into play instead. I will come to that on a future podcast as well. What they weren't taking that much attention on was two other films that were around at this point. Skyfall was on the release schedule, as was The Twilight Saga Breaking Dawn Part 2. Both of these would come back into the story. Now, Ramsey gave a really interesting interview with Vulture, and he talked about how quite a lot of the actors involved in this film hadn't really done animation before, and he talked about it was an adjustment for them. Also, he was a first-time feature film director, and he was directing a hugely expensive animated movie as well. But what he also said was once the cast realised the freedom that they had on a project like this, they really went for it. They had an awful lot of fun. So the movie was making its way through production. It got to the point where they started to be able to test it. And I mean, animated films are regularly tested throughout the making of them, but putting it in front of neutral eyes, and the feedback they were getting was really good. That people were coming out of test screenings, as Ramsey told Vulture, and he said they'd be crying and they'd be saying, "Thank you so much for giving me back my childhood." And at that stage, the feeling was DreamWorks had another hit on its hand. It also had an amazing score. I absolutely adore the score for Rise of the Guardians. It was put together by Alexandre Desplat, and it was Bill Damask, who was the creative head of DreamWorks, who suggested him as an option to score the movie, and Ramsey would admit he absolutely bit his arm off at the opportunity to work with Desplat, and genuinely, the score is really, really, really gorgeous. Now, the film was completed. The idea was that it would premiere in October, that it would have a wide release in November, and talk was already going on about there being a sequel to the movie. Full steam ahead. But then the wind kind of came out of it a little bit of the air came out, because I had a long chat with Peter Ramsey a few weeks after the release of the movie, And he admitted that he started to get a feeling a few weeks before Rise of the Guardians made it to cinemas that they might be in trouble, because what they hadn't acknowledged early on in the marketing of the film was that both Skyfall and the final Twilight movie were tracking much bigger than expected. And this was unexpected competition. Going back to that thinking, animated movies, they only compete with animated movies, right? Not so. What was happening were the indicators were that Twilight and James Bond were going to take some of the family audience that Rise of the Guardians would ordinarily have expected to be able to commandeer pretty much to itself. As Ramsey would describe it, the hit of those two films was something of a perfect storm. Now, I really like Rise of the Guardians a lot. I think it is one of the if not the underrated DreamWorks movie. Just to be clear, I think that the ending's perhaps a little rushed, but I think the themes within it, and I think the visual style of it, and I just think is really something, and I do think it's really, really worth checking out. I'm a big fan of the film, and it did earn good reviews. It's worth noting that it premiered in the October. And the initial feedback was good. However, the daggers were coming out for DreamWorks Animation at this point, because it had announced this ambitious move to 3 animated features a year. 3 times the output of Disney, of Walt Disney Animation Studios, 3 times the output of Pixar. How could it possibly do that and still keep scoring these $500 million grossing worldwide hits? Even its lesser grossing movies like Megamind, for instance. Megamind was just shy of $400 million. And ultimately DreamWorks would spin that off into other things. So Rise of the Guardians, the feeling was, well, that's kind of the line that it's aiming for. However, Hollywood was getting less keen on DreamWorks, I think, by this point. And Ramsey would tell Vulture in that interview I mentioned before, he just said, we learned later that there was a lot of bad blood between the higher-ups at both DreamWorks and Paramount. Now, the Paramount and DreamWorks relationship is key here, that Paramount Pictures had been distributing DreamWorks animation films, but their deal had come to an end, and Rise of the Guardians would be the last film in that deal before 20th Century Fox took things over the following year. As such, was Paramount particularly keen to put all of its energies into distributing a film where it's lost the contract to do all the ones beyond? I don't know. What I do know is Ramsey's quote. He just said, I don't know if it was a personal feud between Jeffrey Katzenberg and the late Brad Gray of Paramount, or what it was. He said, I'm sure it was some kind of business arrangement that had gone sour. All I know is that there was a lot of animosity during the period when our movie was coming up. Anybody who cares about the movie will tell you that the marketing didn't seem to represent what was up on the screen, and that was a huge frustration for all of us. And I believe that too. I think the poster and such like for the film presents something markedly different from what you get, and did the movie no favours at all. When the film came out, the fears were realised to a degree. And it's a weird one, this, that I'm going to talk about a film that grossed $300 million worldwide, over $100 million in the US, over $200 million outside of the US, as a box office disappointment. But as Ramsey himself would describe it, that's really what it turned out to be. The film had cost $145 million to make, and in its opening weekend, the competition was tough. It was up against Twilight, 2 weeks into release, and was already well past 200 million in the US. Skyfall, 3 weeks into its release, well past 200 million in the US. Even Lincoln was still bubbling along, 60 million after 3 weeks. Rise of the Guardians opened in 4th across the Thanksgiving 5-day weekend with a 32 million gross, well below what was expected. And in fact, it was nearly outgrossed by Ang Lee's brilliant Life of Pi that opened the same weekend. That took 30 million. Wreck-It Ralph had been around for a month and had helped itself to 150 million. Rise of the Guardians would not get near that number. Incidentally, one little aside, I was talking when in the Casino Royale bit about MGM's financial problems. One of the films caught up in that, Red Dawn, the remake of, that finally got released many years later. This same weekend, opened in 7th place, 21 million. The competition that weekend was insane, and Rise of the Guardians undoubtedly suffered for it. And for, you can contrast it with the way Wreck-It Ralph was sold as a very savoury family picture, even though I think that film's got some real edge to it. And Rise of the Guardians was struggling. And so what happened in the aftermath of that was the Hollywood press got its pens out. That there were lots of stories going round when a big movie fell, for want of a better way of putting it, of the amount that a studio would need to write down as a result of a movie not doing its box office. John Carter at Disney, Tomorrowland, it would be the same a few years later. That the aftermath stories would be defined by write-downs. For DreamWorks, it was a bit more of a seismic shock that this was actually the start of a rocky patch. The following years, The Croods would do well, but as it moved to 20th Century Fox, the following films, Turbo, Mr. Peabody and Sherman and such like, they would start to really stumble. In the aftermath of Rise of the Guardians, there were big changes at DreamWorks. Films that were coming were put into turnaround or went back in. I mean, Mumbai Musical was one. Me and My Shadow had already gone back in. There's a completed film, BOO, Bureau of Otherworldly Operations, that DreamWorks had spent 120 odd million on, that to this day has never been released and is effectively just a write-off. Now, it is worth noting that Rise of the Guardians did really well on Blu-ray and on home format, but the story was being dominated by the layoffs. The fallout in the aftermath of this film was pretty brutal, and the headlines were quick. That Jeffrey Katzenberg did an earnings call for DreamWorks the year after, and he said he described it as the first movie of ours in 17 in a row that didn't work. And when that happens, it makes you rethink everything. We've done a reset and we've done it across the board. I interviewed Katzenberg once and I told him, I think this is the underrated DreamWorks film. The look on his face, even though he didn't say anything really about that, was he didn't necessarily agree, but I did. I really think, again, there's something to it. But Ramsey knew by the Friday of the film's release it was going to underperform. By the Sunday, he described to me how they had a projection of its full box office run, and it wasn't happy reading. In the aftermath, DreamWorks would lay off a couple of hundred staff. It would restructure its slate of films that were coming up, and those plans for sequel movies, well, they just quietly got shelved. That DreamWorks did still keep moving forward, but the slate, the number of films on the slate would gradually reduce. And I mean, I asked Ramsey about how he felt about it all in the aftermath of it. He just says, I got a lot of kind mentions, even in some of the more lukewarm reviews. He said people didn't take it out on me too badly, but he said the other stuff clouding it, all the corporate stuff, all that hanging around, that's the thing that makes me sad, really sad, because there's so much great work that went into it. There's very little recognition of how beautiful the animation is, the wonderful score. It's criminal that Alexandre Desplat wasn't recognised for it. It just seemed to get lost in the shouting. And he said, to me, that's about the most painful part. I mean, he worked on this for 3 or 4 years, and he said, our crew really put a lot of work into the film. But again, that's the business. Bizarrely, it was also snubbed in not the strongest field of nominees for a Best Animated Picture Oscar nomination. It did get one for the Golden Globes. And ordinarily, that would have been that in the aftermath, Ramsey hung around DreamWorks for a little bit, tried to get one or two of his other projects off the ground in and outside of the studio. But his career would turn around when he got a tap on the shoulder and asked, would you mind getting involved in this project we're working on? That project would turn into Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and his next film would win him an Academy Award. By that stage, DreamWorks was under fresh ownership as well. Katzenberg had left. There was no Rise of the Guardians 2. But with Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, it just built on the bricks that he'd put into place in Rise of the Guardians, and the ambition and the push really to do something a little bit different. All I'd suggest is, if you've not seen the film, do consider digging it out and having a look. I think you might find there's a bit more in it than you might be expecting. Which brings me to the end of this very overrunning episode of Film Stories, and thank you so much for sticking with me thus far. If you want more of my waffle, you can find it on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. Website, got one of those, filmstories.co.uk, updated every weekday with new film news, reviews, features, movie mayhem, really, all sorts of bits and bobs. Thank you for everyone supporting that. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you can find all my magazines and the Sneakers Blu-ray that we made as well. Really proud of that. That's all available to order. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/Film Stories Online, Patreon at patreon.com/Simon Brew, and youtube.com/Film Stories. The most important thing, as always, though, as I head towards a very special episode 200 in a couple of weeks, is that you all take care and look after yourselves. You stay healthy, you stay safe. Thanks as always for your time. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Bye-bye.
You've got a bloody cheek.
Sorry.